Good morning, friends. Today we continue with the poem that we were doing yesterday, and let me give you an overview of what we are going to cover in today's session. We will be completing the poem by looking at the main two sections that we are supposed to be doing today, because we have got introduced to the poet, some of the broad areas, and I will quickly go over that. In the second phase, we will focus on the kinds of questions that might be raised in the context of the poem that we are doing, and then I will wrap up this session by also raising questions about the other two poems that have been completed before this, and the way that again patterns of questions might emerge, making comparisons between the other two poems as well as between this poem and the other earlier Indian English poem that we did together. So, what we did quickly unstated quiet way, short vignettes to create a larger picture, and moving between different times and different places, locations. So, that is why I said that this is a kind of collaging, a kind of a collaging effect that you find, which is again from the cinematic techniques, and we will discuss this further as we proceed with this session. So, we did a different poem, a river, in order to get familiar with his style, and then we moved on to the poem itself, and we did the third section, which right now is not within our text, but for getting a comprehensive picture of the entire poem. And I gave you a quote over here, which talks about the way that some of the other critics have responded to this particular poem. For instance, you see that 3 particular uses of history is and vignettes of historical consciousness. By historical consciousness, we mean to say that the way we understand history, the way we conceptualize history, and the way we historicize the world. We look at things and derive or identify histories emerging out of that. That is what is being talked about, and it is being done in 3 different ways. And one is in the case of Madras in 1965, and that is the place from where the title of the poem emerges, because that is the first use of history and on a rainy day, and the contrast between present and past, which we are going to do right now. And the second part, which is a contrast between 2 radically different cultures, revisiting the past in a different culture and then coming face to face with one's own history, which we shall do as we proceed with the poems. So, Some Indian uses of history on a rainy day. We went through the last section, which we will revisit again in the context of the poem today, but and we will again revisit the concept of the beginning, how the theme is introduced, and the play around the locations, and also revisit the title as we discuss the possible questions which can emerge from this particular text. So, let us go to the first section and try to understand how this poem has been done. And if you remember in our classes, I have again and again repeated that the way that a poem begins tells us a lot of things, and generally what happens with poems is that the entire story is not told. We are given small vignettes and we are expected to complete the entire picture. So, in this particular case also we find that he starts by giving us a very brief, I would say, introduction, which is incomplete and which has been designed in a particular way as to pick our curiosity rather than give us an entire picture of things. And it is photographic or cinematographic, and it is short, epigrammatic, very concise, without giving us any idea of without elaborating any of these things. So, you find that Madras 1965 and rain. Madras 1965 and rain. Head clerks from the Citibank curse, batter, elbow in vain the patchwork gangs of coolies in their scramble for the single seat in the 7th bus. Now, you see that what I would like to say is that Madras 1965, and rain. That is how the poem begins. There is a break in the first line, and this pause kind of establishes that okay, this is the location, this is 1965, this is the year, historically locating the time, and it is raining heavily. And if you close your eyes and if you go back to 1965, you can feel the evocation of the smell of the leather tanneries from the industries in Madras or from Chennai as we call it today, and people waiting in the heat and in the rain. And who are the people waiting? Head clerks from city banks who are going home, lower middle class people. Curse, batter, elbow in vain the patchwork gangs of coolies in their scramble for the single seat in the 7th bus. So, what happens is that the persona or the characters who take center stage in this particular poem are introduced to us, and these happen to be the head clerks from the city banks with a certain degree of sophistication, a certain degree of snobbery when you are there looking at the crowd which is made up of coolies, manual workers, and who look like a patchwork. A patchwork is where different clothes are sewed together, colorful clothes are sewed together. So, it looks more like a patchwork of people, patchwork of a tapestry or an embroidery, and this is a kind of a metaphor which has been used. And this gives us an idea that these people are rather painted, and it is an artistic impression that you get rather than anything else. And these form a very solid mass who are totally unresponsive, totally unaware of these head clerks and their needs, their requirements, their sophistication and all that. So, in spite of cursing at them, battering them, pushing their elbows, it is a failure. They can't enter into the 7th bus because they are interested in the single seat. They are not interested in standing and making the travel, they are interested in the sitting, and they are not able to do that. They tell each other, and how do they spend their time, because they have to wait for the 8th bus. They tell each other how old King Harsha's men bet soft gongs to stand a crowd of 10,000 monks in a queue, to give them and the single visiting Chinaman 100 pieces of gold, a pearl and a length of cloth. So, miss another bus, the 8th, and begin to walk for King Harsha's monks had nothing but their own 2 feet, and this is where the humor, the irony as well as the humor comes in. So, what do these people do? So, they are sitting down and they are talking about the past, and this happens to be a very favorite pastime of the Indians. So, what they are looking at is that okay, in the bygone days, in the golden era, people did not behave in this way, they were much more disciplined. So, the element of discipline in the past is contrasted with the element of crowding, unruliness in the present, and this typical Indian tendency of looking back at the past, glorifying the past, speaking about the past and saying that our past was great is what is highlighted here. And in the process of getting so involved in the talk about history, these people forget that the 8th bus has come and left, and then they realize that there is nothing else to do. So, this is the humor which comes at the end of this particular stanza, where they are talking about the 100 pieces of gold, pearl and a length of cloth. So, miss another bus, the 8th, and begin to walk, for King Harsha's monks had nothing but their own 2 feet. So, the emphasis over here is basically on the fact that King Harsha had nothing to do, because in those days there was no transportation, no development, no roads, and in the process these people had to make do with whatever was available. So, that particular point is being made over here, and the reference to the Chinaman happens to be that of Yun Sang, who visited King Harsha at that particular point of time. So, let us go back, let us revisit and go line by line and find out what exactly is happening. So, they are talking about the past, the discipline, and old King Harsha's men. I am referring to not only the ancientness of the entire process, ancientness of this particular episode, but also referring to a more mature King Harsha, and the disciplining process of a gong, and there is an oxymoron here, because soft and gong, the gong generally sounds loudly, and you are indicating the disciplining aspect of the gong by saying that it is soft. To stand a crowd of 10,000 monks. So, the 10,000 monks who are standing there are waiting very patiently, they are controlled, and the single visiting Chinaman is Yun Sang. And please note that a piece, 100 pieces of gold, a pearl and a length of cloth, indicating the wealth at that particular point of time. So, in the same breath, the golden era of Indian history is revived and being gossiped, being talked about by this group of people, and in the process of their enthusiasm they forget about the past, and here is where the irony comes in. The quiet humor also comes in, because the poet, as an outside person, says that fine. So, you are talking about the glorious past, but please note that in the glorious past they did not have any vehicles, they did not have any buses, and hence if you are trying to kind of say that the past was so glorious, then please in that same spirit walk back home, because there are no more buses which are going to be available to you. So, the other thing is the wealth that is being highlighted, 100 pieces of gold, pearl and length of cloth, the huge amount of wealth that India had at that point of time, and implicitly suggesting the present condition where that does not happen to be the case anymore. So, the second section, let us go to the second section, is about a different context altogether. But before we wrap up the first section, there are a couple of other points that we would like to make. Point number one is that if we contrast it, or if we revisit it in the context of the railway clerk, what exactly do we find? Here also you find that the Indians have a tendency to gossip, the Indians have a tendency to talk about other things, the way that the railway clerk used to talk with his friends about the problems of the country and so on and so forth. Here revisiting the past, talking about the way things are, the typical Indian habit that gets reflected in both the poems. So, this is probably a very distinctive Indian quality that gets to be identified as we start looking at the two poems. But if you are looking at the language, you find that Ezekiel's language is essentially a constructed language, of Indianness, which is very self-consciously used. Whereas, if you are looking at the language which is used by Ramanujan, it is very distinctively English language. It does not have in that sense any Indian elements, very concise, cryptic, short sentences, trying to say a minimalistic approach, saying things in as few words as possible, and trying to also create a word picture like the patchwork gang of coolies, and kind of, if you close your eyes, you visualize the rain, people waiting in the bus stand, and then the coolies rushing in and looking like colorful patchwork and all those things. And then, of course, if you are looking at the thematic element over here, the thematic element is the re-exploration, re-examination of the history of India, and in a glorified manner. So, this first poem is looking at a contemporary context and revisiting the past to make a comparison between the past and the present, and to indicate that the past was much better than the present. And then this entire process is not kind of affirmed by the poetic voice, but questioned, challenged in a very humorous way, because at the end we are told that, well, they did not have technology at that point of time, they did not have mobility of the kind that you have at that point of time. So, you walk back home. If you are looking at the second section of the poem, then we find that we are talking about there is a shift of scene, the way it happens in movies, and that is why the cinematic metaphor is used again and again as we are discussing this particular poem. That second section deals with a different location. There is a strong contrast, the characters, the central characters or the heroes, you might say, in this particular case are very different, and these happen to be Fulbright Indians. Let us understand what is understood by Fulbright Indians. You see that the US Fulbright Fellowship, and if you are looking at 1960s, 1970s and that particular period of time, it was a very prestigious thing. And in those days, the number of people who could travel outside the country was very, very limited. There were not many people who could go outside the country, and these were the Indians who were privileged, and these were the again the middle class Indians who ordinarily would not be able to afford to travel outside the country, but with the help of their fellowship they are able to go out. Now, what is so significant about this tribe or this group of people is that they are extremely proud of the fact that they go out of the country, spend 1, 2 or 3 years and then they come back, number one. And the second thing is that they live with this memory, because in those days going outside once was probably the best thing that could happen to the majority of the Indians who were traveling. I mean, they would probably not be able to make another visit ever again in their lives, and they would come back and start writing short stories about their experience outside the country, or memoirs, or essays about their experience outside, and this particular ethos is what gets reflected over here. So, the Fulbright Indians type in of ivory, type in is a kind of an exhibitionism. You might also call it an anachronism, that maybe others are not doing it, but trying to show off the very little wealth they have been able to create or generate during their stay outside the country, or trying to project themselves as good. Type in of ivory, but there is a very interesting point over here. Colored cameras for eyes stand every July in Egypt among camels. July is a hot month, Egypt is a hot country, and you are coated, booted, suited during the hot month. So, what exactly does it mean? Does it convey a sense of superficiality amongst these people, a sense of a desire to project themselves as something which they are not, because in a hot summer day wearing tie, coat, suit, ivory pin, all those things reflects a particular kind of a mindset. Color camera for eyes, again I would kind of go back to my own past, my own understanding of color cameras and the kind of role they played in those days, because I remember that it was only in the 1980s that for the first time I laid my eyes on a colored photograph which had been printed and sent back by post from Mumbai, and there were two places. One was being sent from, I think, Srinagar or Jammu, Akfa, and the other one was Kodak, which was sent back from Mumbai. And you would take photographs on a color film, send it by post, and the entire process, after a month you would get back the colored prints, and it was a very, very exciting thing for everybody. So, if you are looking at the Fulbright Indians in the 1960s and 70s, when in India color photography was very rare, but they would have to bring back their memories, and the Indians have a tendency, or for that matter today everybody has a tendency of experiencing less the visits that they make and documenting more the visits that they make. So, if you are going out anywhere, the first thing you do is not see things, but take photographs of things, as if to bring back those memories, not through bring back those images, not as memories, but as images. So, for us today the memories are the photographs that we carry rather than the experience we have. In those days also, the people who went outside wanted to make it a point that each place they went to was kind of documented and brought back. Again, a typical Indian tendency, because I have seen people in those days having elaborate albums and showing the images that they had taken, and kind of everybody kind of getting awed by the entire process, because as I told you a little earlier, traveling outside the country was something which was not happening for most of the people. So, what happens? So, giving you the context of the Fulbright Indians, the color photography, what I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that here also certain distinctive Indian traits in a very witty, humorous way are being brought out. But in contrast to Ezekiel, where it was presented in a slightly exaggerated manner with the typical use of Indian English, here it is presented very quietly, very subtly, without any elaborations. So, Fulbright Indians, tie-pins for ivory, colored cameras for eyes stand every July in Egypt among camels, faces pressed against the past as against museum glass. Wonderful twist, exchange. So, it is, you might say it is an elaborate metaphor. The past is like a museum glass, and obviously you cannot revisit the past, you can only look at the past from outside. So, you are looking at the past as against museum glass, tongue tasting dust, amazed at pyramidfuls of mummies swathed in millennia of calicut muslin. So, let us get into the details of the lines and then come back and discuss again. So, these Fulbright Indians were visited with whatever little money they have saved Egypt, are now looking at the various glorious things that are representative of Egypt, and again its history, camels, okay, looking at the mummies, looking at the pyramids, and looking at it with a certain sense of understanding that the past can never be revisited. It can just be looked at as if from across a museum glass, and the entire museum, entire past is as if what is seen through a museum, or the way that it is constructed in a museum. Tongue tasting dust, the heat, the dust of July, amazed, thrilled at pyramidfuls of mummies, but the amazement is less at pyramidfuls of mummies. Now, this pyramidfuls is a constructed word, which is a combination of pyramids which are full of mummies. So, it is constructed and compressed, two words brought together, swathed in millennia, 1000-year-old or thousands of year old calicut muslin, and this is what is amazing for them, to realize the Indian, rich Indian tradition, to discover that in somebody else's past. So, to discover the richness of one's own past in somebody else's past. In the process of looking at the wonders of somebody else's civilization, suddenly realizing that one's own civilization was wonderful, miraculous, because even at that point of time there was an exchange between these two cultures, and more important, something from our culture is they are showcased in their culture. So, this discovery is in contrast to the first part, where you see that the railway, the clerks, the head clerks are well aware of the glorious period of history. They are trying to contrast it, pit it against the rather mundane, ordinary contemporary period. On the other hand, when you are looking at the Fulbright Indians, they think that they are in the glorious period of history, where they are able to go outside the country, explore other places in Europe and even and in places like Greece, Egypt, and it is there that they suddenly rediscover the vivacity, the significance, the importance of their own history. So, this stanza stands in contrast to the other stanza in a very significant manner in that sense. So, now if you are looking at the third one, we revisit the third one, because although we do not have it in our text, which we are doing in the class together, it is a good idea to look at that and kind of complete the entire poem. So, here is the third example of discovering history, but in this case the history is presented in an entirely different context. In the context, the first one was boredom, glorification of history. The second one was discovering or rediscovering the glory of one's own history. The third one is looking at history or some significant iconic representation of history in the swastik as something which gives a connect, gives a sense of security, gives a sense of identity. So, in this case it is identity, it is a sense of security that is being talked about, rather than feeling glorious or rather questioning or challenging history. To find one's own history in somebody else's everyday life, to find one's own everyday life reflected in a very radically different way in somebody else's everyday life. Now, that is what is getting highlighted over here as something which we did not discuss yesterday. So, if we are looking at the possible areas which are of significance, we have talked about the title. These are distinctively idiosyncratic examples of the use of history. These are distinctively personalized and personal insights, experiences of the way that history is used by Indian people. Examples, 3 examples are presented to us. In those examples, there is humor, there is a little bit of wit, and short stories are being told, short episodes are being told, like 3 small episodes of in a movie, vignettes which are juxtaposed, which are put together as a collage to not have a detailed sequence, but to give us a impression of things. Let me explain what I am trying to say again. When we are talking about collage, especially cinematic collage, you find that elements which are not similar, elements which are not continuous are put together, and together they kind of create a composite meaning. In the same way, the 3 stories that are being told to us are not necessarily connected with one another. They are small separate episodes in themselves, but together these 3 kind of create a picture of the different examples of how history is used in the Indian context or by Indians or experienced by Indians. The rainy day, as I told you, refers to the first part of the poem and is not reflected in the other parts of the poem, because in the second section it is more a hot day than a rainy day, and in the third section we have no reference to the weather conditions. So, we have no idea what kind of a day it is. In each case, Ezekiel very quickly introduces the theme in the first 1 or 2 lines. If you are looking at section, let us say section 1, Madras 1965 and rain. Fulbright Indians, tie-pins of ivory, color camera for eyes, July. And then if you are looking at the other section, Prof. 1935, Professor of Sanskrit on cultural exchange, passing through lost in Berlin. So, in each of these cases, the location is very quickly, very shortly, very briefly, very epigrammatically presented to us. Now, playing around with locations, irrespective of in which location you find yourself, the first location is India, the second location is Egypt, third location is Germany. irrespective of location, irrespective of time, because 1935, and the other case you have 1965, the third one no time is given, but somewhere at around maybe 1960s or 70s, 3 different times, 3 different locations, 3 different examples of the way that history is being used. Now, what is important for us from the context of our exams, hopefully we will be having our exams on time and things will go back to normal. The possible questions are significance of the poem's title, as with the other poems that we have done together, the significance of the poem's title. I have kind of elaborated here on what possible things it could mean, and at a later point of time I would request you to please come up with your queries. In fact, during the weekend, if you can send me your queries, like you have doubts or questions, then post in the next Monday, on the next Monday or Tuesday, when I have the next session with you, then I will try to answer all the questions which come to me via your emails. So, how is Indian history used in the poem? So, it is not a question of, so the questions which can be raised here is that, what does history mean over here? Okay, that's the first question which would come. What does history mean over here? How has history been presented here? That I have already discussed. What does history mean over here? History means experiencing history rather than reading history. History means experiencing the relevance of history, or the ironies of history, or the examples of history, or the experience of history in our everyday life. That is what history means. And everyday ordinary encounters with our past, with our memories, is what history means. History is, and in this particular case, the history is not memories of past things, but memories of visits of past to past things, memories of reading about past things, and then bringing them into our everyday life, bringing them into our present lived experience and making sense of it, experiencing it. What does it tell us about Indian identity, Indianness of the poem? Here, as I have said with you, this poem might raise questions, or we might have questions from this poem, where we are asked to talk about not only this poem, but maybe refer to the other poem by Ezekiel. And if that happens, what becomes important is that we understand that it may be a good idea to bring in both the poems, or points raised in both the poems together. How is it that the Indian elements are brought in? What are the distinctive Indian components that you find in this poem? Indian people, whether they are in Madras in India, whether they are Fulbright Indians outside the country, whether there is a Pandit, a Sanskrit orthodox scholar in Germany. 3 categories of Indians. In fact, the second and the third category are close, because both are out on scholarships. Middle class, lower middle class, having a certain degree of intellectual capability, because even for the head clerks stand above the other categories, and talking about history is a way of trying to project their sense of distinctiveness or difference from the ordinary mundane people of the country. So, that is the other thing that we are looking at. And what does it tell us about our identity? How do Indians behave? How do they experience their identity? How is it that in our everyday life history, our own historical identity intrudes, surprises us, or becomes a part of our everyday life? If you are talking about swastik, very often even in our everyday life today, swastik is a part of our life. If you are talking about discovering the Egyptian mummies and the Calicut muslin, then we have a situation where we are looking at history, where history surprises us by making us face it suddenly, encounter, a surprise encounter. And if you are looking at the third one, the German one is everyday life, this one. And if you are looking at the episode in Madras, that is where history is used to illustrate or to contrast with the present conditions. So, There can also be a question on the use of history that we talked about, and can be referred, these points that I made right now can be linked to the first question that we raised about Indian uses of history. But our entire identity, it seems, is in some way linked to our way of experiencing history, using history in everyday life, or understanding or discovering history at various locations and various places. Questions, our habit of doing different things that we have seen, the Fulbright Indians, the railway clerk, the head clerks. In all these cases, we find that they are distinctive categories of Indians which are brought to our notice, and their typical behavior which is also brought to our notice. More important, a problematic question which I am leaving it open for you to discover, because there is no clear cut answer to that, is it that Indian identity is something which is under pressure because of the rapid westernization, of exposure to multiple culture? Is it that we take recourse to history to kind of reiterate, to tell ourselves that yes, we have a distinctive identity, and this identity is linked in some significant manner to our history? So, these are the kinds of questions that might come up. At the end of this session, what I would like to do is quickly make a recap of the other poems that we had done together and the other possible questions. The Negro Speaks of Rivers we have done together, identity I told you, the title I told you, the relation between the poem and the title I told you, the significance of the word Negro I told you. These are some of the important areas from which questions can come. And when it comes to telephone conversation, the relevance of color, power, and the way one reacts to power, protests against power, kind of undermines power, puts power back on its own, overturns power by taking a aggressive stand. These are some of the issues we have already discussed. Black identity is something on which questions can come, where you are asked to compare and contrast the two poems. How is it that in one case it is aggressively taken up, presented overtly, that is the first poem, as the second poem, that is telephone conversation over here. On the other hand, when you are talking about the Negro Speaks of Rivers, the entire thing is done very subtly without ever directly focusing on the white people and the contrast between the black and white. Protest is something which is running very distinctively through telephone conversation and very subtly through the Negro Speaks of Rivers, and this we discussed fairly elaborately in the classes we had together. So, friends, at the end of this session, as I am about to wrap up, what I would like to share with you is that please share queries, questions related to the poems, because post mid-sem the poems that we were supposed to do we have completed. So, if there are any other questions, queries, please send me an email so that I will compile them, and when I come to the next class in the next week, I will answer those questions. In tomorrow's class, we will be focusing on the text by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Balthazar's, the poem, this short story, Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon. And so, friends, my request is that please go through the text. We are not going to go through the text line by line over here. We will look at fundamental thematic issues and we will focus on them and discuss the story. So, my request to all of you is that please go through this particular text wherever you are, and when we are sitting with the discussing the text tomorrow, everybody has gone through the text and we have a meaningful discussion, so that you can link what you have read to what I am going to share with you. Have a safe weekend after tomorrow's session, but please keep safe, and please keep it in mind that I repeat to you again, tomorrow we are doing Balthazar's Marvelous Afternoon, and you must read the text when we go online and have this class. Thank you.